Okay, so this video we'll be looking at the part 2 of the endocrine system anatomy and physiology, and we will be concentrating on the hypothalamus and then the pituitary gland. Okay, kindly support the channel by subscribing and then clicking on the like button, and also do well to share content on the channel to your friends who may find this video very useful. Okay, so now let's begin with the hypothalamus. In fact, the hypothalamus is also referred to as the master regulator of the endocrine system. It's the master regulator. Okay, it's more like the president of the endocrine system, like the chief. Okay, you should see the hypothalamus beyond a gland. That is why you can't call it the master gland. Okay, and that is why we are using the master regulator. Okay, because it's ahead of the glands. Is that okay? If you are talking of the master gland, then that would be the pituitary gland. But the hypothalamus is the chief regulator of the endocrine system. It's like the master. It's like the supreme when we are talking of the endocrine system. And so we use the master regulator. In some literatures, they also call it the head ganglion. Okay, and the reason why we call it the head ganglion is because it's the hypothalamus that actually coordinates signals between the nervous system and endocrine system. You realize that the hypothalamus sort of links or connects the nervous system and the endocrine system. Okay, the hypothalamus also helps in maintaining the body's internal balance, that is homeostasis. It regulates essential body processes, including hunger, including thirst, the body temperature, sleep-wake cycles, emotional behavior, and sexual activity. Okay, so you realize that the hypothalamus is like the chief regulator of the endocrine system. It controls everything. Okay, and one thing about the hypothalamus that you need to know, that anatomical, even though the hypothalamus is a very small organ in the endocrine system, I don't want to call it a gland. Yes, because I see the hypothalamus beyond just a gland, so I prefer you use organ. Okay, so the hypothalamus as an endocrine organ is very small, almond-sized structure which is located in the brain. Okay, in fact, the hypothalamus forms the floor and part of the walls of the third ventricle just below the thalamus. And this organ or gland actually accounts for less than 1% of the total brain mass. Now, note that despite the size, in fact, the hypothalamus is very small in size. Okay, because the weight of the hypothalamus, even though it's not the smallest endocrine organ, the smallest endocrine organ is the pineal gland. That is the smallest. The pineal gland is about 5 to 8 mm long and weighs around 0.1 grams, the pineal gland. Okay, but when it comes to the hypothalamus weighs, it's also very small. It weighs like 4 grams. Okay, with a length of about 4 centimeters, a weight of about 1.5 centimeters, and a height of about 1.5 centimeters, which is also relatively very small. Is that okay? Although the hypothalamus is larger than the pineal gland. Is that okay? Good. So like I said, it accounts for less than 1% of the total brain mass. But despite its size, the hypothalamus plays crucial role in regulating vital body functions. Okay, so remember that the hypothalamus is known as the master regulator, not the master gland. It is the master regulator or the head ganglion. Okay, because it coordinates, is the hypothalamus that coordinates or links the nervous system with the endocrine system. And in fact, because it's the master regulator, we can say that we can recognize it when we are talking about even the functions of other glands. Is that okay? Because the hypothalamus sort of have an influence, or it plays a role in even regulating the pituitary gland activities. Okay, good. So the hormone control center, in fact, it sends chemical signals. It sends what kind of signals? Both releasing and inhibiting hormone signals. Okay, to go and instruct the pituitary gland on when to release its hormones and also to inhibit the release of its hormones. Okay, so it's more like a hormone or a hormonal control center. It controls the pituitary gland. Okay, because the pituitary gland is the master gland. The hypothalamus is the master regulator. In fact, the pituitary gland activity influences the performance or the activities of other glands. So if the hypothalamus is the hormone control center that controls the pituitary gland, then it tells you that the hypothalamus is the supreme. That's why we say is the master regulator. Okay, and that is how come we also accord the hypothalamus the other functions or the other roles of most of the glands in the endocrine system. So if you talk of, you talk of sleep-wake cycle, which is the is done or falls under the pineal gland. But then you see, we recognize the hypothalamus for that. Okay, we talk of hunger, we talk of thirst. Okay, we talk of sexual activity, which we accord that mostly to the gonads, like the ovaries and then the testes. But the hypothalamus is being recognized for that activity. Yes, because it's the master regulator for everything, even everything. Okay, that's why it's the master regulator. So like I mentioned, the hormonal control center. Okay, it's more like a hormone control center. Okay, because it regulates, it sends signals to the pituitary gland, signals to go and stimulate it to release, or signals to go and inhibit its release of hormones. Okay, good. And then the hypothalamus actually operates, okay, using the feedback regulation. It uses both negative and positive feedback mechanisms to maintain hormonal balance. Is that okay? So for example, when it is releasing a hormone or releasing its hormone to go and stimulate a certain gland to produce hormone, once the gland start producing the hormones and it reaches a certain level, a feedback mechanism will be sent back to the hypothalamus that, oh, we have enough of these hormone. Then that mechanism will cause it to stop releasing. Okay, so it uses feedback mechanism, both positive feedback and negative feedback mechanism, to maintain the hormonal balance, control the hormone levels in response to internal changes in the body. Okay, now it has some transport systems. It has two transport systems. Okay, the hypothalamus has two transport systems. Okay, we call that the hormone transport systems. Okay, whereby the hormones are transported from the site of production to their target via two primary systems in the hypothalamic pituitary axis. Okay, so it has two transport systems. The two transport systems. Okay, we have the hypophyseal portal system, or how we call the adenohypophyseal system. And then we have the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. Okay, hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. In some literatures, they also call it the neurohypophyseal system. Okay, so it has two transport systems. The hypothalamus as an endocrine organ actually connects with the pituitary gland. Okay, it controls the activities of the pituitary gland. Okay, and so it tells you that there is a channel between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Now, the pituitary gland comes in two parts: the anterior pituitary gland and then the posterior pituitary gland. Okay, the hypothalamus actually connects to the anterior pituitary gland, okay, using blood vessels, and that is why we use the word adeno. Okay, we call that adenohypophysis. Okay, the pituitary gland, we also call it the hypophysis gland. So, the part of the pituitary gland, the anterior pituitary, connects to the hypothalamus using blood vessels. Okay, that is why we call it the adenohypophysis. And so the transport between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, we call it the adenohypophyseal system, or we call it the hypophyseal portal system. So it's like the hypophyseal portal system is the portal system connecting the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary. Okay, then we have another portal system that we call the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. Okay, or you can call it the neurohypophyseal system, because you see the hypothalamus actually connects to the posterior pituitary using a nerve fiber. Okay, now remember that the hypothalamus in itself actually produces hormones. Okay, so if you take the pituitary gland has two parts. We have the anterior pituitary gland, posterior pituitary gland. Okay, the posterior pituitary gland do not produce hormones. There are some two hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus, which are stored in the posterior pituitary. Is that okay? So we have two transport systems. Those transport systems are connecting the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. That is the first condition. The second condition is that the pituitary gland is in two parts. Okay, the anterior pituitary gland and then the posterior pituitary gland. The anterior pituitary gland actually connects to the hypothalamus using blood vessels. Okay, and the transport system between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, we call it the hypophyseal portal system or adenohypophyseal system. Okay, then the hypothalamus also connects to the posterior pituitary using a nerve fiber. Is that okay? It uses a nerve fiber pathway. Is that okay? So in that pathway, that's pathway where the hormones that are actually, some hormones are actually produced in the hypothalamus, which are stored in the posterior pituitary. So when those hormones are produced in the hypothalamus, they go through the neurohypophyseal system or the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. They go through that pathway. Okay, they are transported and synthesized in the hypothalamus. Is that okay? Then they are sent to the posterior pituitary for storage. Is that okay? So that means that there is a neural connection. There is a kind of neural connection or a connection using a nerve fiber between the hypothalamus and then the posterior pituitary. Is that okay? So the pathway is such that the hormones are actually synthesized in the hypothalamus. Okay, then it goes through, it's transported along the axons of the neurons. Okay, it uses what we call neurosecretory vessels. Okay, then it's transported along the axons of the neurons. Then it goes to be stored in the axon terminals in the posterior pituitary, because you see the neuron connecting, the nerve fiber connecting the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary, it has axon terminals. So once it is produced in the hypothalamus, okay, then it is transported along the axons of that neuron. And when it gets to the axon terminals are actually within the posterior pituitary. Then those hormones are stored over there. Okay, so it's like the hypothalamus is connected to the posterior pituitary there is a nerve fiber directly connecting the two. So I see the posterior pituitary more like part of the hypothalamus. So the posterior pituitary is connected to the hypothalamus using a neural connection. And so the transport system, so there is no hormone being produced in the posterior pituitary. It's actually it stores two hormones that are actually produced in the hypothalamus. Is that okay? Good. And those hormones are oxytocin and then antidiuretic hormone. Oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, ADH, or you can call it vasopressin. Okay, ADH and vasopressin. Is that okay? But then the hypothalamus is also connected to the anterior pituitary using blood vessels. And that is why we refer to that transport system. Any connection in endocrine system is a transport system. Okay, because endocrine system entirely is a communication system. Okay, so the hypothalamus connects to the anterior pituitary using blood vessels, and that connection is using blood vessels. That is why we also call it the adeno. Adeno means reference to blood vessels. Adenohypophyseal system, or you can call it the hypophyseal portal system. Okay, hypophyseal portal system. So anytime you hear hypophyseal portal system, it's more like a connection using blood vessels between the hypothalamus and then the anterior pituitary. Okay, but then in the anterior pituitary gland produces its own hormones. It's the posterior pituitary that do not produce its hormones, but it stores hormones produced in the hypothalamus. How? Then you explain that there is a nerve fiber connecting the hypothalamus directly to the posterior pituitary. So when the hormones, specifically oxytocin and antidiuretic or vasopressin, when they are produced in the hypothalamus, they are transported along the axons of the nerve fiber, and when they get to the axon terminals are within the posterior pituitary. Then they are stored in the axon terminals, more like some secretory vesicles. Then they are released into the posterior pituitary to be stored in the posterior pituitary. Is that okay? So there are two transport systems when you are talking of the hypothalamus. The transport systems connect the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary and then the posterior pituitary. What are these transport systems? We have a transport system connecting the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary and a transport system connecting the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary. The transport system connecting the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary is via blood vessels, and so we call that transport system the hypophyseal portal system or adenohypophyseal system. Okay, that is the transport system that connects the hypothalamus with. Okay, so it is through that transport system that the hypothalamus is able to release its hormones. Okay, and that is what actually, in fact, it is actually that transport system that makes the hypothalamus actually an endocrine gland. It's actually that portal system, the hypophyseal portal system, that makes the hypothalamus, because you see, the hypophyseal portal system make use of blood vessels. Okay, so the hypothalamus releases its releasing and inhibiting hormones into that blood vessels, connecting the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary, so that the hormones are in the blood vessels. Then the blood vessels also has a connection with the anterior pituitary. Then it's able to influence the activities of the anterior pituitary. But then with the posterior pituitary, the connection with the nerve is a neural connection. So the posterior pituitary does not even make the hypothalamus more of endocrine. It's the anterior pituitary connection that makes the hypothalamus a recognized endocrine gland. Is that okay? Because of that, the blood vessel connection. Is that because the principle with endocrine system is that the hormone has to be released into the blood. It makes use of chemical signaling, not nervous system or impulse signaling. Is that okay? Good. So basically that is it for the hypothalamus. So the transport system. Now we will look at some of the hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus. So now you understand that we have hormones that are actually produced by the hypothalamus. Some of the hormones are actually stored in the hypothalamus itself, and they are released when the need be to maintain balance in certain activities in the body or in internal environment. Now, some of them are also produced in the hypothalamus, but they are not stored in the hypothalamus. So because of that, even though they are produced there, they are not stored. And because they are not stored in the hypothalamus, they are not released in the hypothalamus. Okay, and those hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus, but they are not stored there, they are part of the hormones produced by the hypothalamus when you are describing the hypothalamus in terms of the hormones that they produce. Okay, so now let's go into the hormones produced by the hypothalamus. So the hormones produced by the hypothalamus. All right, so this is what I was talking about. So the hypothalamus, the master regulator. Is that okay? So you see the hypothalamus. This is the hypothalamus. Okay, over here, this is it. This is the hypothalamus. Okay, this is the hypothalamus. You see, this is the thalamus. And then the hypothalamus is located over here. And you see the hypothalamus actually connects to the posterior pituitary and then anterior pituitary. Okay, so over here. So the posterior pituitary and the anterior pituitary. And we are saying that the hypothalamus actually connects to the anterior pituitary using blood vessels. And that is why we say it is adenohypophyseal system. And because of that, when we start looking at the pituitary gland, you realize that this anterior pituitary, okay, we also call it adenohypophysis. Is that okay? Adenohypophysis. Okay, and the posterior pituitary, we also call it the neurohypophysis gland. So this is adenohypophysis gland, neurohypophysis gland. Why adenohypophysis gland? Because it's connected to the hypothalamus using the blood vessels. Why neurohypophysis gland? Because it's connected to the hypothalamus using a neuron or a nerve fiber. Is that okay? We will get to all that. Okay, so in this the hypothalamus actually produce a lot of hormones. But two of these hormones, they are produced over here, all right, in the hypothalamus, but they are stored in the posterior pituitary, which is oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, or another name for that hormone is vasopressin. Is that okay? So basically, this is what we are talking about. Now, let's look at the hormones produced by the hypothalamus. And when it is produced by the hypothalamus, which cell, the hypothalamus hormones actually goes to what? To stimulate or to either go and stimulate the pituitary to either release or inhibit the release of a particular hormone by the pituitary gland. So in this slide or on this table, we are going to look at the hormone produced by the hypothalamus. Which cell in the pituitary gland that they actually stimulate? And when it's stimulated, what hormone will it stimulate the pituitary gland to produce? That is what this table. So this table is a very detailed table. Good. And you have to pay rapt attention to understand the exegesis of the functions of the hypothalamus. Now, this is the hypothalamic hormone. So meaning the hormone produced by the hypothalamus. This is the target cell in the pituitary gland. And then the pituitary hormone stimulated or inhibited. So now, the first hormone produced by the hypothalamus is the thyrotropin releasing hormone. The thyrotropin releasing hormone, TRH. The thyrotropin releasing hormone. When the thyrotropin releasing hormone is produced, in fact, the thyrotropin releasing hormone, corticotropin releasing hormone, growth gonadotropin releasing hormone, growth hormone releasing hormone, growth hormone inhibiting hormone, or another name, somatostatin, prolactin inhibiting hormone, dopamine, melanocyte stimulating hormone. All these hormones are produced in the hypothalamus. All these hormones, they are produced in there, including antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. All these hormones are produced in the hypothalamus. Just that these ones are stored in the hypothalamus. This one, thyrotropin releasing hormone, corticotropin releasing hormone, gonadotropin releasing hormone, growth hormone releasing hormone, growth hormone inhibiting hormone, prolactin inhibiting hormone, melanocytes stimulating hormone. These hormones are produced and stored in the hypothalamus, but these very one, antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin, these very ones, they are produced in the hypothalamus, but they are transported via neurons to the posterior pituitary to be stored in the posterior pituitary. Okay, so antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin, they are produced in the hypothalamus, but they are transported, okay, to the posterior pituitary through the nerve fibers. So the axon terminals of those nerve fibers connecting the hypothalamus to the pituitary, they are within the pituitary. So their secretory vessels are released and they are stored inside the pituitary gland. Is that okay? Good. So apart from the antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin, all of them are produced in the hypothalamus, but only these ones are stored in the posterior pituitary. So they are produced in the hypothalamus and transported to the posterior pituitary to be stored. So if you are asked to mention hormones produced by the hypothalamus, you mention all of this. Is that okay? Good. Now, so let's continue. So the thyrotropin releasing hormone, okay? This hormone, when it is released, it targets the thyrotroph cells in the pituitary gland. Okay, so we have so many cells in the pituitary gland. Okay, so the pituitary gland contains all these cells. So when the thyrotropin releasing hormone is released, it targets the thyrotroph cells in the pituitary gland. Then once these thyrotroph cells are stimulated, okay, the pituitary gland will produce thyroid stimulating hormone. And also the pituitary gland will be stimulated to produce prolactin release. Okay, it will be stimulated to produce or release prolactin. Is that okay? So the thyrotropin releasing hormone, when it is produced in the hypothalamus, it is released into or through the hypophyseal portal system, okay, or adenohypophyseal system. Then it goes to stimulate the pituitary gland, specifically the thyrotroph cells in the pituitary gland. Then the thyrotroph cells, when stimulated, will produce the thyroid stimulating hormone. So that means this hormone is produced by the pituitary gland, okay, by the thyrotroph cells in the pituitary gland. Now let's go to the next one, corticotropin releasing hormone. This hormone is produced by the hypothalamus. It is transported through the hypophyseal system. It goes to the pituitary gland. Then it targets the corticotroph cells in the pituitary gland, stimulates the corticotroph cells. Then it will cause these cells will now produce the adrenocorticotropic hormone. So that means the adrenocorticotropic hormone is produced by the pituitary gland. Okay, so this corticotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus would come through the hypophyseal portal system, stimulates this corticotroph cells in the pituitary, so that the pituitary gland now produces adrenocorticotropic hormone. Now, the next hormone from the hypothalamus is the gonadotropin releasing hormone. Gonadotropin releasing hormone. So the gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH. The gonadotropin releasing hormone is transported through the hypophyseal portal system, which is a blood vessel, okay, to the pituitary gland. Okay, then when it goes to the pituitary gland, it targets the gonadotroph cells. And once the gonadotroph cells are stimulated, they produce the follicle stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone. The follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Let's go one more time. So the gonadotropin releasing hormone, it is transported through the hypophyseal portal system or adenohypophyseal system, which is a blood vessel. And it goes to the pituitary gland. When it reaches the pituitary gland, it targets the gonadotroph cells. Once the gonadotroph cells in the pituitary gland are stimulated, follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, and luteinizing hormone, LH, are being produced. Now, the next is the gonadotropin, growth hormone releasing hormone. Growth hormone releasing hormone. We have two growth hormones produced in the hypothalamus. We have growth hormone releasing hormone and growth hormone inhibiting hormone. Growth hormone releasing hormone and growth hormone inhibiting hormone. Okay, growth hormone releasing hormone and growth hormone inhibiting hormone. All of them target somatotroph cells in the pituitary. Now, for the growth hormone releasing hormone, it is transported through the hypophyseal portal system, goes to the somatotroph cells in the pituitary. Once the somatotroph cells in the pituitary are stimulated, it will cause the pituitary gland to produce growth hormones. Now, the growth hormone inhibiting hormone, or somatostatin. Okay, so when this hormone is being produced by the hypothalamus, it goes to the pituitary gland, target the same somatotrophs, but this time, because it's a growth hormone inhibiting hormone, it will stimulate it, but when it's stimulated, it will inhibit growth hormone secretion. Remember that the growth hormone releasing hormone will rather facilitate, okay, the growth hormone production. But the growth hormone inhibiting hormone, it will stimulate the same somatotroph cells, but then it will inhibit growth hormone secretion. Is that okay? Good. Then we have prolactin inhibiting hormone, or dopamine. Prolactin inhibiting hormone. Don't forget that we have prolactin inhibiting hormone. We don't have anything like prolactin releasing hormone, because the thyrotropin releasing hormone is the same hormone that actually stimulates prolactin release. So if we want to inhibit prolactin, that is when we only have the prolactin inhibiting hormone, or dopamine. Now, the prolactin inhibiting hormone, it stimulates the latotroph cells in the pituitary gland. It stimulates the latotroph cells in the pituitary gland. It stimulates the latotroph cells in the pituitary gland. Once the latotroph cells in the pituitary gland are stimulated, the pituitary gland would inhibit prolactin release. Okay, the pituitary gland, that will inhibit the release of prolactin from the pituitary gland. Okay, now we have the melanocyte stimulating hormone. Melanocyte stimulating hormone and then inhibiting hormone. Okay, so it's a stimulating hormone and an inhibiting hormone. In fact, this is the only stimulating hormone produced in the hypothalamus. Apart from this, all stimulating hormones are produced in the pituitary gland. Okay, this is the only stimulating hormone, the melanocyte stimulating hormone. In fact, it is melanocyte stimulating inhibiting hormone. And the stimulating aspect, this is the only stimulating hormone produced by the hypothalamus. So we have melanocyte stimulating hormone, inhibiting hormone. Okay, this hormone actually goes through the hypophyseal portal system, go and stimulate the melanotroph cells in the pituitary gland. Once these cells are stimulated, it will inhibit melanocytes. Okay, it will inhibit melanocyte stimulation hormone release, or it will stimulate the hormone. Okay, depending on which angle you are coming from. So if it's the melanocyte stimulating hormone that is being released, because you see it's two hormones combined, melanocyte stimulating inhibiting hormone. So if it is the stimulating and it stimulates the melanotrophs, it's going to stimulate melanocyte hormone. Okay, so melanocyte stimulating hormone will be released. But if it is the melanocyte inhibiting hormone and it stimulates or sensitizes the melanotrophs will produce inhibiting hormone, melanocyte inhibiting hormones. Is that okay? Then we have the antidiuretic hormones and oxytocin. These ones are produced in the hypothalamus, but they are actually stored in the posterior pituitary gland. Okay, they are stored in the posterior pituitary gland. And in fact, because they are stored in the posterior pituitary gland, they are released from the posterior pituitary. Is that okay? So they are not made in the posterior pituitary, but they are released in the posterior pituitary. Remember that. Now note that the hypothalamic somatostatin actually regulates hormonal output. If you go to and then output from the pituitary, whilst the pancreatic somatostatin helps balance blood sugar and digestion by moderating insulin, glucagon, and digestive secretions. Now, this point is very important because when you start looking at the digestive system, you realize that we would also talk about somatostatin in the digestive system. Okay, but the somatostatin that we spoke about, the hypothalamic somatostatin, meaning the somatostatin produced by the hypothalamus, rather regulates hormonal output from the pituitary, whilst we have somatostatin that is produced by the pancreas. When we start looking at the pancreas, you realize that the pancreas also produces somatostatin. But the hypothalamic somatostatin regulates hormonal output, whilst the pituitary hormonal output within the pituitary gland, whilst the pancreatic somatostatin helps balance blood sugar and digestion by moderating insulin, glucagon, and digestive secretions. Okay, so in summary, these are the hormones produced by the hypothalamus and then the cells that they specifically target in the pituitary gland. Is that okay? So in summary, this is the hypothalamus. Okay, so the hypothalamic hormones, we have the thyrotropin releasing hormone, the corticotropin releasing hormone, CRH, the gene small nRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone, the gene capital HRH, growth hormone releasing hormone, the gene capital H, capital I, capital H, growth hormone inhibiting hormone, or somatostatin. Okay, then we have prolactin inhibiting hormone, or dopamine. We have melanocyte stimulating hormone inhibiting hormone. Okay, so all these hormones are there, and we have the cells in the pituitary that they actually stimulate. And when they stimulate these cells, we have the corresponding activity that is pituitary gland would perform under that stimulation. So that tells you that these cells are all cells in the anterior pituitary. So the thyrotroph cells, the corticotroph cells, the gonadotroph cells, the somatotroph cells, the lactotroph cells, the melanotroph cells. These are all cells in the anterior pituitary. Is that okay? We didn't talk of the posterior pituitary because the posterior pituitary only stores hormones. No hormones are produced there. So you can think of the fact that no endocrine producing cells will be there. Do you get it? Because the hormones are produced in the hypothalamus. These two hormones, antidiuretic hormone and then oxytocin, they are produced in the hypothalamus. Then they are transported to be stored in the pituitary, in the posterior pituitary gland. Is that okay? So this brings us to the end of the hypothalamic hormones, or the hypothalamus as an endocrine gland. Okay, so you see we have the hypothalamus. So take note that most of the releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones, or anytime you hear releasing hormone, inhibiting hormones, remember that they are produced in the hypothalamus. Okay, because the hypothalamus produce the releasing and inhibiting hormones to go and control the activities in the pituitary gland. So anytime you are reading any question, you see releasing hormone, inhibiting hormone, we are talking about a hormone that is produced by the hypothalamus. Okay, so like corticotropin releasing hormone, CRH, hypothalamus. Okay, thyrotropin releasing hormone, hypothalamus. Gonadotropin releasing hormone, hypothalamus. Growth hormone releasing hormone, hypothalamus. Prolactin inhibiting hormone or dopamine, hypothalamus. Prolactin inhibiting hormone is the same as dopamine. Is that okay? Prolactin inhibiting hormone is the same as dopamine. And we have another hormone, the melanocyte stimulating inhibiting hormone. Okay, that is the only stimulating hormone produced in the hypothalamus. Melanocyte stimulating inhibiting. Even that, we have inhibiting attached to it. That is if you learn it properly. It's melanocyte stimulating inhibiting hormone. So even that, even though we have the stimulating component, but it's actually an inhibiting hormone too. So remember that all the releasing and inhibiting hormones are produced by the hypothalamus. And in addition to that, the two other hormones that are produced there but not stored there. So that means those hormones are produced there because they are not stored there, they are not released in the hypothalamus. Okay, so that is the antidiuretic hormone or the vasopressin and oxytocin. Antidiuretic hormone and vasopressin or oxytocin. Those hormones are not actually stored in the hypothalamus. They are produced in the hypothalamus, but they are not stored there. So because of that, they are not released from the hypothalamus. They are released from the posterior pituitary. So always remember that these two hormones, antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin, are hormones that are produced in the hypothalamus, but in actual sense, they are stored in the posterior pituitary. And because of that, if they ask you hormones that are released by the posterior pituitary, there are two: antidiuretic hormone and then oxytocin. They are not produced there, they are stored there. So because of that, they are only released there, but they are not produced there. Is that okay? Kindly take note of that distinction. Okay, good. So this is what we were talking about. So you see, we have the posterior pituitary gland and then the anterior pituitary gland. Okay, you see, we have the portal venous. So like I said, the posterior pituitary gland is connected. So you see, this is a blood vessel. Okay, the posterior pituitary gland is connected to the hypothalamus using blood vessels. So you see, we have this blue is showing the hypophyseal portal system. So the anterior pituitary gland is connected to the hypothalamus using blood vessels. So this tract is what we call the hypophyseal portal system. Okay, and you see some neurons over here. You see these neurons, nerve fibers. They are based, okay, their nucleus or their head is within the hypothalamus, but then their axon terminals is within the posterior pituitary. So there are some hormones that are produced in the hypothalamus, the antidiuretic hormone and then oxytocin. They are produced here. They are transported along the nerve, the axons of this nerve fiber. Then they get to the axon terminals and they are released through the secretory vessels into the posterior pituitary and stored in the posterior pituitary gland. And that is why this portal system, okay, we call it the hypothalamic. Okay, that is what we are talking about, the hypothalamo hypophyseal tract. Is that okay? So that tract uses nerve fibers. Okay, nerve fibers. Is that okay? So this pituitary gland, this particular pituitary gland, posterior pituitary gland, it doesn't produce any hormone. It's rather stores hormone that are produced in the hypothalamus and transported through the hypothalamo hypophyseal tract, okay, into the pituitary gland. But over here, this one has a connection. You see, this hypothalamus connects to the anterior pituitary using blood vessels. So you see, this one is a blood vessel. It uses a blood vessel. Okay, the portal venous. That is what connects the hypothalamus to. Okay, so in actual sense, the hormones that are produced over here, they are transported through these vessels to come and stimulate some cells within the anterior pituitary, stimulate them to produce some specific hormones. Is that okay? Stimulate them to produce some specific hormones. Okay, so these are the hormones produced by the hypothalamus: gonadotropin releasing hormone, thyrotropin releasing hormone, corticotropin releasing hormone, prolactin releasing hormone, growth hormone releasing hormone. So all these hormones goes through the hypothalamic hypophyseal tract, okay, or the hypophyseal tract or system into the anterior pituitary to go and stimulate specific cells in the anterior pituitary to cause the anterior pituitary to also produce their hormones. Is that okay? So basically, that is it for the hypothalamus as an endocrine gland. Remember that in summary, this gland is the master regulator. This gland is the master regulator of the endocrine system. The master regulator. They basically regulate the activities in the pituitary gland. And you know the pituitary gland is the master gland. Okay, so this is the master regulator, and this is the gland that actually connects the nervous system with the endocrine system. Okay, this brings us to the end of the endocrine system, the series that actually focuses or centers on the hypothalamus. Okay, kindly subscribe to the channel if you've not subscribed to the channel, so that you always receive notification once a video is uploaded. Okay, and then share the content on the channel to your friends who may find the videos very useful. Thank you so much, and then continue to study very hard. All the best.